There's a bitter truth no mother wants to admit sometimes. We love our children so much that we forget to teach them how to love us back. I am living proof of that. The night my son called me a burden, I didn't just lose a home, I lost the illusion of who I thought I was. But inside the old handbag that held my entire life, there was something he could never have imagined. A small slip of paper, worth $10 million. As I stood alone under the streetlight, I no longer felt like a victim. I was a survivor with a new beginning, and I couldn't help but wonder, how will he feel when he one day discovers that the burden he threw away could now carry the world? The door slammed shut. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 58 years old. And 20 minutes ago, my only son, Daniel, told me to get out of his house. His house. The words still echo in the quiet space where my heart used to be. He didn't shout them. Shouting, I think, would have been easier. A storm is something you can brace yourself against. But he said it with a quiet, tired finality. The kind of tone you use to close a business deal you no longer care about. I am standing on the sidewalk now. The Savannah humidity is thick, clinging to my skin like a damp shroud. A soft, apologetic rain is beginning to fall. It feels like the sky is weeping for me. Because I find that I cannot, my eyes are dry. Shock has a way of doing that. It steals your tears before you even know you need them. I can still see it all. Behind my eyes. The living room. With its cool gray walls that Chloe, my daughter-in-law, picked out from a magazine. The sleek leather sofa I could never get comfortable on. Always feeling like I might slide right off. I was sitting on the very edge of it. My hands clutching my purse. I had just told them my news. My happy news. I've retired. I had said, a smile trembled on my lips. I gave my notice at Mrs. Blackwood's estate last week. I wanted to be here full-time when the baby comes. I can help with everything. The cooking. The cleaning. Silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The kind that sucks all the air out of a room. Daniel was staring at his phone. His thumb frozen over the screen. Chloe was examining her perfectly manicured nails. Each one a tiny, glossy shield. Her mother, Beatrice, who was visiting, let out a small, sharp sigh, a sound like a slow leak in a tire. You retired. Daniel finally looked up from his phone. His eyes, the same warm brown eyes I used to gaze into as I rocked him to sleep, were cold, blank, as if looking at a stranger. You quit your job. Now. My smile faltered. It's the perfect time, I said, my voice starting to lose its cheerful edge. With the baby on the way, I thought, and what about your pension? Ellie Beatrice cut in. Her voice was smooth as glass and just as hard. One must be realistic in these times. A woman your age, with no income. She let the sentence hang in the air. Unfinished and sharp, I looked at Daniel. My son, I just needed him to look at me. To give me a small nod. To tell his mother-in-law that everything was fine. But he just looked back down at his phone. As if the answer to all of this was hiding there. On that little glowing screen, I tried again. My voice smaller now. I've saved a little. I just wanted to help. To be a grandmother. To rock my grandbaby to sleep. Chloe laughed. It was not a happy sound. It was a tiny, brittle thing. Like ice cracking. We've hired a night nurse. Mother Vance, she said, not looking at me. And my mother will be here. Honestly, you would just be in the way. In the way, the words hung in the air between us. I have been a lot of things in my life. A wife, for a short time. A widow, for a very long time. A housekeeper for the kindest woman I ever knew. But I had never, in all my 58 years, been in the way. I turned to my son. My last hope, I needed him to say something. Anything. To tell them they were wrong. To defend me. He finally put his phone down on the coffee table with a soft click. He rubbed his face. A gesture I knew meant he was deeply stressed. I thought, for a foolish second, that he was about to stand up for me. Mom, he said. His voice was flat, empty. The expenses are about to double when the baby gets here. We need you to be useful, not another mouth to feed. Another mouth to feed? A strange calm washed over me then. The kind of calm that comes after the worst has already happened. I thought of the 30 years I worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses by day, waiting tables at a diner by night after his father passed. I thought of the college tuition I paid, every last cent, so he wouldn't have the burden of student debt. I thought of the down payment for this very house, a check I gave them with tears of joy streaming down my face. I carried you not just for 9 months. Daniel, I have carried you for 30 years. I carried you through fevers and failures, but it seems my back has finally broken under the weight of your indifference. I stood up. My knees felt stiff. Old, I see, I said. My own voice sounded distant, like it was coming from across the room. Where are you going? Chloe asked. A flicker of something, maybe panic, maybe just annoyance in her eyes. He told me to get out, I said, looking directly at my son. My Daniel, so I am getting out. He stood up then, his face flushed with a dark red color. Mom, don't be so dramatic. I just meant, you can't just stop working. You need to contribute. I walked to the door. I did not look back. I could feel his eyes on me. I could feel all of their eyes on me. They weren't seeing a mother. They were seeing a problem, a miscalculation on a balance sheet, a burden. I opened the heavy front door and stepped outside. The humid air hit me like a wall. I heard the lock click behind me, a sharp, final sound, the sound of a door closing not just on a house, but on a life. So here I stand, on a strange sidewalk in Savannah. In the rain, a 58-year-old woman with a small, worn purse, a thin coat, and a heart that has been neatly and efficiently evicted from its home. But he doesn't know. He doesn't know about the letter tucked away in the side pocket of my purse. A letter I've been saving to open on my first official day of retirement. A final gift from my last employer. The dear Mrs. Blackwood. He doesn't know what's inside it. He doesn't know that his mother, the useless old burden, is now worth $10 million. The letter, I walked for a long time. The rain plastered my thin coat to my skin, but I hardly felt the chill. I just put one foot in front of the other. When the click of my sensible shoes on the wet pavement, the only sound that felt real, finally, I saw the flickering neon sign of a motel. The Palmetto Inn. The P was burnt out, so it just read, the Palmetto Inn. It seemed fitting, a place with a piece of its name missing. For a woman who felt like a piece of her soul had just been carved out. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. The bedspread was a faded orange color, thin and scratchy to the touch. A single lamp cast a weak, yellow circle of light on the peeling wallpaper. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning in protest. This was it. This was the first night of my retirement, my golden years. I felt a hollow ache spread through my chest. It was a loneliness so profound. It felt like a physical weight. For 30 years, every decision, every dollar earned, every prayer I whispered at night had been for Daniel. Without him, who was I? What was I for? My fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the clasp of my purse. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a familiar object to hold on to. That's when I felt it. The crisp corner of an envelope, the letter, Mrs. Blackwood's letter. Madeline Blackwood had been my employer for the last 15 years. But she was more than that. She was my friend. I was her housekeeper. But she treated me like a confidant. We would sit in her sun-drenched library, me polishing the silver, her reading her poetry aloud. She saw things in me I had long forgotten about myself. She would look at my rough, work-worn hands and say, "Ellie, these are an artist's hands. Don't you ever forget that." She passed away a month ago, quietly, in her sleep. Before she left, she had given me this letter, sealed with her favorite wax stamp. A tiny mockingbird. "Don't open this until your first day of freedom. My dear," she had whispered, her voice frail as dried leaves. "Promise me." I promised, with trembling fingers. I broke the seal. The paper was thick and creamy. Her handwriting was as elegant as she was. Each letter a graceful swirl. I began to read, "My dearest Ellie." It started. My eyes welled up instantly. "If you are reading this, it means you have finally retired. You are free. I know how much you have sacrificed for that boy of yours. I have watched you work until your bones ached. Watched you put every dream you ever had on a shelf to gather dust so that he could have his. A mother's love is a powerful thing, Ellie. But it should be a wellspring, not a drain. I had to stop and wipe my eyes. It was like she was right here in this sad little room with me. I cannot be there to celebrate with you. The letter continued. But I wanted to give you a small gift. A little push to start your new chapter. Tucked inside this letter is a Powerball ticket. I bought it with a sequence of numbers you once told me were important to you. Your Daniel's birthday. Silly. I know. But consider it a bit of foolish hope from an old woman. My fingers found the small, stiff paper folded inside the letter. It felt unreal. I had forgotten I had even told her those numbers. Now, for the important part. She wrote, and I could almost hear the gentle command in her voice. Whether this ticket wins $1 or nothing at all is not the point. The point is the promise I want you to make. Promise me you will buy yourself a set of paints. Promise me you will find a canvas and face its emptiness without fear. Your life, my dear friend, has been a service to others for too long. And then, the final, prophetic words. Ellie, my dear, don't let that boy of yours be the final chapter of your story. You have a masterpiece inside you. Use this, whatever it may be, to paint it. Tears were streaming down my face now. Not for my son, not for my own sorrow, but for this incredible woman who saw me so clearly, almost as an afterthought. I pulled my old phone from my purse. The screen was cracked. I squinted, my fingers clumsy as I typed in the lottery numbers from a few weeks back. It was a foolish hope. Just as she said, I checked the first number on the ticket. It matched. A small coincidence. I checked the second. It matched. My breath caught in my throat. The third. It matched. The fourth. Matched. The fifth. Matched. My heart was hammering against my ribs. A frantic, wild drumbeat. I looked at the last number. The Powerball. It matched. I dropped the phone on the bed. I stared at the ticket in my hand. The cheap paper felt impossibly heavy. I picked up the phone again, my hand shaking so hard I could barely read the screen. Jackpot winner. 1 ticket sold in Savannah, Georgia. $10 million. No, it can't be. I leaned back against the peeling wallpaper. The room spinning around me. The smell of bleach and stale smoke. The thin, scratchy bedspread. And in my hand, a piece of paper worth more money than my family had ever seen in 100 lifetimes. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. It was a raw, broken sound. Here I was, a homeless woman, a burden, another mouth to feed, and I was a millionaire. My first instinct, the instinct of a mother for 30 years, was to call Daniel, to tell him everything was okay, that I could fix his problem, I could pay off his mortgage, I could buy his wife a new car, I could make him love me again. My thumb hovered over his name in my contacts, but then I heard Mrs. Blackwood's voice, as clear as if she were sitting beside me. Don't let that boy of yours be the final chapter. I lowered my hand. I sat there in the buzzing silence of that cheap motel room, in the weak yellow light, and I did not call my son. I just sat there, clutching the lottery ticket to my chest, feeling its impossible weight. And for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't thinking about what I needed to do for Daniel. I was thinking about what I needed to do for Eleanor. The Ghost of Savannah. The man's name was Marcus Thorne. He was a lawyer. His office was in one of those old, respectable brick buildings downtown, the kind with floors that creak with history. He was a tall, kind-faced black man, about my age, with silver temples and a calm that seemed to settle everything around him. Mrs. Blackwood had listed him in her letter. He will handle everything, she had written. He is a good man. She was right. I sat across from his large oak desk, the lottery ticket and the letter laying between us like evidence in a trial. I felt small, out of place, like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a cathedral. He explained things slowly, carefully. Trusts, anonymity, financial advisors. The words washed over me, a language from a world I had only ever cleaned and dusted. I just nodded. He set up something called the Blackwood Legacy Trust. It felt right. This wasn't my money. Not really. It was a mission, a responsibility. A week later, I had a key, not to a small apartment in a noisy complex, but to a penthouse, a word I'd only ever read in books. It was in the historic district of Savannah, with a wrought iron balcony that overlooked the cobblestone streets and the old oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The real estate agent, a young woman with a smile as bright as her blazer, called the view breathtaking. I suppose it was, but when she left, and the heavy door clicked shut behind her, the first thing I noticed wasn't the view, it was the silence. The silence in this apartment is louder than any argument we ever had. It was a vast, empty quiet. It filled the high ceilings and echoed off the gleaming hardwood floors. For 30 years, my life had been filled with the sounds of Daniel, his first cry, his laughter as a child, the thump of his basketball in the driveway. Even the moody silence of his teenage years was a kind of noise. My life had been a house full of him. This new life, this was an empty palace. What does a woman like me do in a place like this? I tried to do the things I thought a rich person would do. I bought a cashmere sweater that felt softer than a whisper, but it just made me feel like an imposter. I ordered food from a fancy restaurant, but it tasted like loneliness. I would stand on that beautiful balcony and watch the happy tourists below, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. Every morning, my hand would reach for the phone to call him, just to check in, just to hear his voice. An old habit, ingrained deep in my bones. And every morning, I would have to force my hand back down. He did not want to hear from me. He had made that clear. I was a mouth to feed, a burden. Did he even wonder where I was? Did he care if I was safe, warm? Did he feel even a flicker of regret? The questions circled in my head. Relentless. A mother's love, I'm learning, doesn't just switch off. It just aches. One afternoon, I forced myself to go for a walk, just to feel the sun on my skin. I wandered through the old squares, letting my feet lead me. And then, I saw them, across the street, in front of a large, imposing bank, stood Daniel and Chloe. They were not happy. Chloe was waving her hands, her face tight with anger. Daniel, oh, my Daniel, he looked broken. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale with a kind of despair I recognized. It was the same look he'd had when he failed his driver's test the first time, the same look when he didn't get into his first-choice college. It was the look of a boy who felt the world was collapsing on him. My heart gave a painful lurch. Every instinct screamed at me to cross the street, to wrap my arms around him, to say, "It's okay. Baby, Mama's here. I'll fix it." But I didn't move. I ducked behind one of the large oak trees, my own body feeling as ancient and rooted as its trunk. I watched as he ran a hand through his hair, his back to her, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. He was drowning, and I, the woman who had spent her entire life as his lifeguard, stood by and watched. Because he was the one who had told me to let him go, I walked back to the apartment, my legs feeling heavy as stone. The beautiful city now felt like a cage. This money, this freedom, what good was it if the one person I loved was in pain? But then, I heard Mrs. Blackwood's voice in my memory, as clear as day. "Don't let that boy be the final chapter of your story." That night, I did something different. I walked past the expensive shops and the fancy restaurant. I found a little art supply store tucked away on a side street. The bell above the door tinkled when I entered. A cheerful, hopeful sound. It smelled of turpentine and possibility. I bought the best easel they had, tall and sturdy, made of dark, polished wood. I bought a large, blank canvas. I bought brushes of every size, and tubes of oil paint in colors I hadn't allowed myself to dream of in years. Cobalt blue, cadmium yellow, viridian green. I carried it all back to my silent apartment myself. I didn't arrange for delivery. I needed to feel the weight of it, the reality of it. I set the easel up in the middle of the grand living room, right in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. A dark, wooden sentinel facing the breathtaking view. It was a promise to Mrs. Blackwood. It was a challenge to myself. I stood there, looking at that blank canvas, and for the first time, I didn't know what to paint. If you were in my shoes, holding all that power and all that pain, What would be the first stroke of your new life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories. They help me feel less alone on this journey. A crack in the facade. The days after that first meeting with Mr. Thorne felt strange. I was living in a beautiful apartment that felt like a movie set, with more windows than I had plates in my old kitchen, but the silence was the loudest thing in it. It was a hollow, echoing silence that followed me from room to room. I knew I couldn't just sit there. Mrs. Blackwood hadn't given me a second chance just so I could watch the dust motes dance in the afternoon sun. One morning, walking through the historic district, I saw it. A little art gallery tucked away on a cobblestone side street. It had a faded blue door and a sign that read, "For sale." The windows were dusty, the life inside gone. It reminded me of how I felt, empty, but the structure was still beautiful. It just needed someone to come in, open the windows, and let the light back in. Something inside me clicked. It was the first real feeling, the first clear thought I'd had in weeks. 2 weeks later, it was mine. I told Mr. Thorne to handle the paperwork. I paid in cash. I decided to name it the Blackwood Gallery. It felt right. It was a way to keep her memory alive, to build something beautiful from the legacy she had given me. For the first time since that terrible night, I felt a flicker of purpose. I spent my days there, overseeing the painters and the floor sanders. The smell of fresh paint and sawdust was clean and honest. It was the smell of something new being built, and it began to chase the ghosts out of my corners. It was during one of those busy, hopeful afternoons that Mr. Thorne called me. His voice on the phone was different. Usually, he was calm and professional. Today, he sounded cautious. "Eleanor," he said, "I have some information for you. I think it's best we discuss it in person. Can you come by my office?" An hour later, I was sitting in the same leather chair I had sat in when I first learned about the money, but the feeling was entirely different. A cold dread was creeping up my spine. Mr. Thorne slid a folder across his polished desk. He didn't open it. He just rested his hands on top of it. "As part of setting up your foundation," he began, slowly, "we did a standard review of any assets tied to your name. That included the house on Forsyth Park, the one you co-signed the mortgage on for your son." I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "The house is in foreclosure, Eleanor." The words were quiet, clinical, but they hit me like a physical blow. "What? No, Daniel," he would have told me. Mr. Thorne's eyes were full of a sad kindness. "He defaulted on the payments 3 months ago. The bank is scheduled to auction it off in 2 weeks. He paused, letting the information sink in. "There's more." He told me everything. It wasn't a story of bad luck. It was a story of foolish choices. My son, my Daniel, had taken out a second mortgage on the house. Without telling me, he had used that money and all of their savings to invest in cryptocurrency. Following a tip from one of Chloe's well-to-do cousins, he was trying to get rich quick, to keep up with her family, to prove he wasn't just the son of a housekeeper. The market had crashed. He lost everything. Everything. The new car they had bought, the designer clothes Chloe wore, the expensive dinners they posted pictures of online, all of it was a lie. Financed by debt. He wasn't just broke, he was drowning. He owed money not just to the bank, but to high-interest lenders. Dangerous people. I sat there, frozen, listening. Each word Mr. Thorne said was a small, sharp piece of glass falling into place, forming a picture I had refused to see. I thought back over the last year, the way Daniel always seemed tired, shadows under his eyes, the way he would flinch when his phone buzzed, the way Chloe would talk about their friends' vacations with a brittle, envious edge to her voice, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety in their home that I had mistaken for the normal stress of a young couple. I had seen the cracks. I just didn't want to believe the whole facade was about to crumble. The anger came first, a hot, furious wave. He had lied to me. He had gambled with the home I had worked my fingers to the bone to help him get. He had stood in that living room and called me a burden, when all along, he was the one sinking the ship. But then, just as quickly, the anger dissolved, and what was left underneath was a pain that was deeper, more complicated. He didn't kick me out because he hated me. He kicked me out because he hated himself. He couldn't face me. He couldn't admit his failure. So he made me the problem. He turned his shame into cruelty and aimed it at the safest person he knew. The one person he thought would always be there to absorb the blow. His mother. I thanked Mr. Thorne. My voice, a hoarse whisper. I walked out of his office and back to my beautiful, empty apartment. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the expensive furniture. I walked over to the easel I had bought. The canvas was still there, stark white, mocking me with its emptiness. For weeks I had stared at it, not knowing what to paint. My past was too painful, my future too uncertain, but now I knew. I picked up a brush. I didn't reach for the bright yellows or the hopeful blues. I dipped it into the jar of black paint, the color of secrets, the color of debt. With a steady hand, I drew a single, dark line straight down the middle of the canvas. It was a harsh, unforgiving mark. It was a wall, a boundary. On one side was the woman I had been, the mother who gave everything. On the other side was the woman I needed to become. I didn't know what her picture looked like yet, but I knew she would never again let someone else's chaos become her own. The confrontation. The grand reopening of the Clare Gallery was everything I had hoped for. The walls, now a soft, warm white, made the paintings sing. Soft light spilled onto the polished floors. The air hummed with quiet conversation and the scent of wine and fresh flowers. For the first time in a long time, I felt proud. I wore a simple navy blue dress, one that Mrs. Blackwood had given me years ago. And for the first time, I felt like I belonged in it. I moved through the small crowd, smiling, talking to the artists, my heart feeling fuller than it had in months. This was real. This was mine. I had built this. I was standing near my own painting, the one I called Boundary, talking to a kind, elderly couple. When the little bell above the door chimed, I glanced over, a welcoming smile ready on my lips, and then my smile froze. It was Daniel and Chloe. The rhythm of the room seemed to slow down, the gentle hum of conversation fading to a dull roar in my ears. They looked lost. Chloe's designer dress was slightly wrinkled, and Daniel's suit, one I knew he'd bought to impress his in-laws, looked too big for him now. His face was thinner, etched with lines of worry I had never seen before. They stood frozen just inside the doorway, their eyes wide as they scanned the room. And then, their eyes found me. I saw the sequence of emotions on Daniel's face, as clear as watching a storm roll in. First, confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a dark, bruised anger. He saw me, standing here. The owner, the host, the woman who was supposed to be a burden. I excused myself from the couple, my voice steady. Though my hands had suddenly gone cold, I walked towards them, my steps even, measured. I would not let them see me falter, not here. Not in this place I had built from the ashes of the life they had burned down. Daniel. Chloe. I said. My voice was calm, quiet. Mom Daniel's voice was a harsh whisper. What is this? What are you doing here? This is my gallery, I said simply. Chloe let out a shaky, almost hysterical laugh. Your gallery? What are you talking about? Did you find some rich old man to set you up? The ugliness of her words stung. But I didn't flinch. I just looked at my son. Let's talk in the office, I said, turning and walking towards a small room at the back. I didn't wait to see if they would follow. I knew they would. I closed the office door behind them, and the gentle sounds of the party were instantly muffled. We were alone, just the three of us, in a small, white room. Daniel spoke first, his voice thick with a mixture of shame and fury. You've been lying to us. All this time, we've been struggling. We lost the house, and you're playing art gallery owner. I have never lied to you. Daniel, I said, my voice still quiet, but with a new edge of steel to it. You told me to get out. You told me I was useless. I simply listened. So, what is all this? He gestured wildly at the closed door. Where did you get the money for this? Who are you with? That is no longer your concern, I said. no longer my concern. He took a step closer. He was taller than me. But for the first time, I didn't feel small. I am your son. We are your family. You have a responsibility to us. Chloe stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. But her eyes were on me. They were hard and calculating. He's right. Eleanor, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We're gonna have a baby. Your grandchild. You can't just abandon us when you clearly have resources. Resources. That's what I was to them. Not a mother. A resource. Something inside me. Something that had been cracked and broken for weeks. Finally clicked into place. It was a cold, hard piece of certainty. I looked at the man standing before me. My son. The boy I had taught to ride a bike. The boy I had held when his heart was broken for the first time. And I saw him for what he was. A stranger. A weak man who blamed the world for the holes he had dug himself. I looked him straight in the eye. My voice, when I spoke, was not the voice of the tired, weeping woman who had stood on the sidewalk in the rain. It was the voice of Mrs. Blackwood. It was the voice of my own survival. My responsibility was to raise you to be a man. Daniel, not to clean up the messes of one. He recoiled as if I had slapped him. I continued, my words coming out calm and measured, each one a carefully placed stone building a wall between us. You stood by and let your wife and your mother-in-law call me a burden in the house I helped you buy. You told me I was another mouth to feed. You didn't want a mother. You wanted a safety net. I took a small breath. Well, the net is gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Chloe's mouth was slightly open, her calculating expression replaced by one of pure shock. But it was Daniel's face that I will never forget. The anger drained away, leaving behind a pale, stunned emptiness. He looked at me as if he had never truly seen me before. He was seeing a woman, not just his mother. A woman with a spine, a woman with a boundary, and he had no idea what to do with her. I turned and put my hand on the doorknob. I have guests to attend to, I said, my voice polite, distant. I would appreciate it if you would leave. I opened the door and walked back out into the soft light and gentle murmur of my new life. I did not look back to see them go. I didn't have to. I could feel the cold draft from the space where they used to be. The party continued. People laughed and drank wine and talked about art. And in the center of it all, I stood tall. The sounds of my old life were finally fading. The sounds of my new one were just beginning. Whispers and lies. For a few weeks after the gallery opening, there was a fragile peace. The confrontation with Daniel and Chloe had been painful, but it had also been clarifying. The line I had painted on that canvas was no longer just a symbol. It was a real wall I had built. And for the first time, I felt I was standing on the right side of it. The Blackwood Gallery began to fill my days. I found a quiet joy in arranging the artwork, in the gentle hum of conversation from visitors, in the way the afternoon light fell across the polished wooden floors. I was building something that was mine. But peace, I have learned, can be a fleeting thing, especially in a city as old as Savannah. Here, secrets and stories travel on the humid air, sticking to you like morning mist. They seep into the cracks of old buildings and whisper from the moss hanging in the live oak trees. I first noticed it at the market on Saturday morning. Mrs. Gable, a woman from my old church circle, saw me by the tomato stand. Normally, she would pull me into a hug that smelled of lavender and mothballs. That day, she just gave me a tight, thin smile, nodded once, and turned her back to inspect a basket of peaches with intense interest. It was a small thing, but it felt like a door being quietly closed in my face. Then, a few days later, a young artist who displayed his work in my gallery approached me. He was a sweet boy, always nervous. He fidgeted with the cuff of his shirt. Mrs. Vance, he started, his eyes darting around the room. I heard about your family situation. I'm so sorry you're going through that. My family situation, I asked, my voice calm, though a cold knot was forming in my stomach. He flushed a deep red. Oh, goodness, I've said too much. It's just people are talking about your son. People were talking, of course. They were. Daniel. unable to face the truth of his own failures, had chosen to write a new story. A story where he was the victim. He didn't need a newspaper. He just needed the fertile ground of neighborhood gossip. He told people I had abandoned him and his pregnant wife, that a mysterious, wealthy man had swept me off my feet, and that I had turned my back on my own blood for a life of luxury. He painted a picture of a devoted son, heartbroken and struggling, and a selfish, cold-hearted mother. It was a simple, cruel, and very effective story. It made his downfall my fault. I started to feel it everywhere. The subtle shift in a shopkeeper's gaze, the sudden silence when I walked into a room. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the woman who was building something new. I was becoming a whisper, a cautionary tale told over coffee. I tried to ignore it. What did it matter what strangers thought I had my gallery? I had Mrs. Blackwood's legacy. But it did matter. It was like watching someone vandalize a portrait of you, and you were powerless to stop them. My name, the only thing I truly had left from my old life, was being tarnished. The final straw came on a Tuesday evening. I was learning how to use one of those social media websites, trying to promote the gallery, and I saw it. A post from Chloe. There was no name mentioned, but there didn't need to be. It was a long, rambling post about the importance of family, and how tragic it was when elders forget their responsibilities in pursuit of selfish desire. She wrote about the struggles of starting a family, and how heartbreaking it was when the ones who should be your foundation become a storm. Underneath, there were dozens of comments. People I knew, people from my old neighborhood. They sent her prayers. They called her strong. They called the unnamed woman in her story a disgrace. I felt a cold, hard anger settle deep in my bones. It wasn't the hot, messy anger of before. This was different. It was a quiet, focused rage. He had taken my home. He had taken my savings. I would not let him take my name. Imposter syndrome. Mr. Thorne had called it that feeling of not deserving my new life. But this wasn't that. This was about the truth. I had lived a quiet, dignified life for 58 years. I had worked hard. I had loved fiercely. I had made mistakes. Yes. But I was not the villain in my son's sad story. I looked across my apartment to the wall where I had hung a small, framed photograph of Mrs. Blackwood. She was smiling, her eyes full of a strength that defied her age. She had been the subject of gossip her whole life, a wealthy widow who never remarried, who valued art more than society's approval. She never let it touch her. She owned her story. I realized then that silence wasn't strength anymore. It was permission. I picked up my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I found the contact information for the local journalist Mr. Thorne had mentioned weeks ago, a woman known for her in-depth human interest stories. I pressed the call button. Hello. A professional voice answered. This is Maria Sanchez. Ms. Actions. Sanchez. I said, my voice clear and even. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I have a story I'd like to tell you. The real one. The whole truth. The reporter's name was Anna. She was young, with kind, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than you were saying. We sat in my small office at the gallery, a pot of jasmine tea steaming between us. For a full day before she arrived, I had paced the floors of my apartment, wrestling with doubt. Was I doing the right thing? Was I just airing my family's dirty laundry for the whole city to see? My hand had hovered over the phone a dozen times, ready to call it all off. But then, I would look at the portrait of Mrs. Blackwood that hung on my wall. She had faced down greedy relatives and dishonest business partners her whole life, always with her head held high. She never let anyone else tell her story for her. I knew what she would have wanted me to do, so I sat with Anna, and I told her everything. My voice didn't tremble as I thought it would. It was quiet, steady. I spoke of the early years, the joy of raising Daniel, the fierce, protective love I felt for him. I told her about the 2 jobs, the scraped-together savings, the pride I felt when I handed him the check for the down payment on his house. I even showed her the bank statement from all those years ago, a little piece of my history, preserved on paper. Then, I told her about that final night. I recounted the words. Useless. A burden. Another mouth to feed. I said them without anger, without tears. I said them like facts, like pieces of a puzzle that when put together, created a picture of my new reality. And then I told her about Mrs. Blackwood. I spoke of her kindness, her wisdom, and her final, incredible gift. I explained that the money was not a lottery win, it was a legacy, an inheritance of hope. I showed her the letter. I wanted the city to know that this gallery, this new life, was built not on luck, but on the foundation of a deep and meaningful friendship. Anna listened patiently, her pen scratching softly in her notebook. When I finished, she asked me the question I was dreading. And your son's situation now? Mrs. Vance, she asked gently. I've heard the rumors about his financial troubles. I took a deep breath. This was the hardest part. It would have been so easy to sound triumphant, to paint him as the villain who got what he deserved. But looking into Anna's eyes, I couldn't do it. He was still my son, I began, and my voice cracked just a little. My son made some unwise decisions. He was under a great deal of pressure, and he made mistakes that have cost him dearly. I paused. I am deeply saddened by his struggles, but I have learned that a parent's love cannot always be a rescue. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is let your child learn to stand on their own 2 feet, even if you have to watch them fall first. I did not tell my story for revenge. I told it because the truth, like art, deserves to be seen in the light. The article came out on a Sunday. It was on the front page of the local section. The headline read, "The Matriarch's Masterpiece, How a Savannah Housekeeper Inherited a Fortune and Reclaimed Her Life." I sat in my apartment with the newspaper spread out on my kitchen table, my hands trembling as I read. Anna had been fair. She had been kind. She had told the whole truth, weaving together the threads of sacrifice, love, betrayal, and finally, rebirth. The phone started ringing before I even finished my first cup of coffee. First, it was Marcus, my lawyer, telling me I was a brave woman. Then came calls from the artists at the gallery, offering their support. Old neighbors I hadn't heard from in years called to say they were proud of me. The florist who supplied the gallery sent a bouquet of white lilies with a card that simply said, "For a strong woman." The whispers that had been following me around the city changed. The looks of judgment were replaced with looks of admiration. That week, more people came into the gallery than ever before. They didn't just come to look at the art. They came to see me. They came to shake my hand, to share a piece of their own story, to tell me that my story had given them courage. Daniel and Chloe were silent. The venomous social media posts stopped. It was as if a bright light had been shone on them, and they had retreated back into the shadows. I had taken back the narrative. I had taken back my name. But in the quiet of the evenings, after the gallery was closed and the well-wishers had gone home, a strange emptiness would settle over me. I had won. There was no doubt about that. But winning a war against your own child feels a lot like losing. I had saved myself, but I had lost my son. Perhaps I had lost him long before that final night. But this was the final, undeniable proof. The article was out. The truth was free. But my heart was still in 1,000 pieces. If you are still listening to my story, if you have walked with me this far, would you do me a kindness, please? Leave a comment with the words, "I am here" below, so I know I am not alone in this final stretch of my journey. Your presence is the greatest comfort as I prepare to tell you what happened in the end. The final plea. The aftermath of the newspaper article was not loud, like I had feared. It was quiet. It was the heavy, weighted silence that falls after a fever breaks. The phone at the gallery rang with words of support. Old friends reached out, their voices full of a kindness I hadn't realized I had missed so much. The whispers that had followed me down the street seemed to fade, replaced by respectful nods. I hadn't sought victory. I had only sought the truth, and now that it was out, I felt tired, deeply tired, right down to my bones. The fight was over. All I wanted now was to be left alone with my paintings and my quiet life. But the story I was learning was not done with me yet. It was a Thursday afternoon, a week after the article was published. I was at the gallery, arranging a new series of coastal landscapes, when the little bell above the door chimed. I turned, a polite smile ready for a customer. It was Chloe. I almost didn't recognize her. The polished, confident woman who had dismissed me from her living room was gone. The woman standing by the door looked fragile. Her expensive clothes hung loosely on her frame. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. Her hands were twisting the strap of her purse. A nervous, repetitive motion. Her belly, round with my grandchild, was the only vibrant thing about her. She didn't approach me. She just stood there, by a painting of a stormy sea, looking lost. I was the one who broke the silence. "Chloe," I said. My voice was even. I felt no anger, no triumph. I felt nothing at all. And that emptiness scared me more than any rage. Her head snapped up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "Mother Vance," she whispered. The name sounded strange. A relic from another lifetime. Can I talk to you for a moment?" I led her to the small office in the back, away from the curious eyes of the few patrons in the gallery. I gestured to a chair and sat down behind my simple wooden desk. The desk felt like a shield, a necessary distance. She didn't sit. She stood, her hands still worrying her purse strap. "I read the article," she said, her voice barely audible. "All of it." I waited. "It was all true," she continued, looking at the floor. "Everything you said, the money, Daniel losing everything. It was all true." She took a shaky breath. He's not doing well, Mother Vance. He doesn't get out of bed most days. He just stares at the wall. The phone calls from the people he owes money to, they don't stop. We lost everything." I remained silent. This was not my storm to calm. Not anymore. "I'm not here to ask for money for us," she said, finally looking at me. Her eyes were filled with a desperate, raw fear. "I know we don't deserve it. We don't deserve anything from you, God. I know that now." She paused, placing a protective hand on her belly. "But I'm here for her," she whispered. "For this baby, she's innocent in all of this. She didn't do anything wrong, and she's going to be born into this mess. Into nothing." Tears began to stream down her face, silent and unchecked. "I'm not asking you to forgive us. I'm not even asking you to be in her life if you don't want to. But I am begging you. Is there anything you can do to protect her? Maybe a trust fund, something just for her, that we can't touch. Something for her education, so she has a chance that we've ruined." She was asking me to save my grandchild from her own parents. The irony was so bitter, it almost made me want to laugh. She was asking me to do for her daughter what I had always done for my son, to be the safety net. I looked at her, at this broken, frightened young woman, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something. Not forgiveness, but a kind of weary compassion. The compassion you feel for a foolish child who has finally understood the consequences of their actions. I let her stand there in her fear for a long moment. I needed her to understand that this was not a negotiation, that her plea was not what was moving me. Then, I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of my final decision. "I have already done it," I said. Chloe's head jerked up, her tear-filled eyes wide with disbelief. "What?" "When I first found out about Daniel's debts," I explained, keeping my voice steady and professional, "I had my lawyer, Mr. Thorne, set up an irrevocable trust. It is for my grandchild. It will pay for her health care and her education, all the way through university. It is legally protected. Neither you nor Daniel will ever be able to access a single penny of it. The funds go directly to the institutions." I let the words settle in the quiet room. This was not a gift born from her tears. It was a choice I had made in the cold light of reason, a long time ago. It was a gift for the baby. Yes, but it was also a boundary, the final, clearest boundary of all. Chloe stared at me, her mouth slightly open. Then, a sound escaped her, a choked sob that was part relief and part overwhelming shame. She crumpled into the chair, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I did not go to her. I did not offer a comforting hand. I stood up, walked to the small water cooler in the corner, and filled a paper cup. I placed it on the desk in front of her. It was a small, simple act, an offering of water to someone who was thirsty. It was not forgiveness. It was not an embrace. It was just water. A quiet, final act of humanity. The Rangerai had been drawn, and we both knew we would never cross it again. Legacy. Time, I've found, doesn't heal all wound. It doesn't erase the scars, but it does soften them. It turns the sharp, jagged edges into something smooth you can live with. It has been 5 years now. 5 years since I stood in that office and made a decision that changed everything. I don't live in the grand penthouse anymore. It was beautiful, but it was never truly me. The silence there was too heavy. A couple of years ago, I sold it and bought a small cottage out on Tybee Island. It's nothing fancy, just a little house with weathered gray shingles, a porch that smells of salt and sea, and a small room at the back that I've turned into a studio. The windows look right out onto the ocean. Some mornings, I sit with my coffee and just watch the colors of the sky change, and I feel a sense of peace that no amount of money could ever buy. The Clare Gallery is my true home now. It's more than just a business. It's a sanctuary. On Saturday mornings, it's filled with the sound of children's laughter during our free art classes. On Tuesday afternoons, it's a quiet haven for my women's workshop, a group we call the Second Canvas. We are all women who are starting over. In one way or another, we paint, we talk, we drink tea. We have built a new kind of family, one held together, not by blood, but by shared understanding. I still paint every day. My hands, once rough from cleaning supplies, are now perpetually stained with little flecks of cadmium yellow and cerulean blue. They are the marks of a life chosen. I hear things. Of course, Savannah is a small town in a big city's clothing. News travels, the pressure, it seems, was too much for Daniel and Chloe's marriage. Without the promise of an easy fortune, their foundation of shared ambition crumbled. They divorced about a year after the baby was born. Chloe moved to Atlanta to be with her mother. She took the little girl with her. I receive a Christmas card from her every year, a simple card with a school picture of my granddaughter. She's a beautiful child with my son's brown eyes. On the first card, Chloe had written a small note at the bottom. It just said, "Her name is Madeline." It was, I suppose, the only apology she knew how to give. I've saved every card. Daniel is still here, in Savannah. Marcus, my lawyer, who has become a good friend, tells me he eventually declared bankruptcy. He works now as a manager at a logistics company out by the port. A steady, respectable job. He lives in a small apartment downtown. He pays his bills. He is, by all accounts, standing on his own 2 feet. I saw him once. About 6 months ago, I was in a small coffee shop near the waterfront, waiting for a friend. He walked in. He looked older. The boyish softness was gone from his face, replaced by a quiet weariness. He didn't see me. He ordered his coffee, paid, and sat at a table by the window, alone. He just stared out at the passing ships. I watched him for a long moment. I waited to feel something, a rush of anger, a wave of sadness, a flicker of the old, aching love, but there was nothing. Just a strange, hollow quiet. It was like looking at an old photograph of someone you used to know. The recognition is there, but the connection is gone. He was no longer the center of my world. He was just a man in a coffee shop, a stranger. I got up and left before my friend arrived. I used to think that the legacy Mrs. Blackwood left me was the $10 million. I was wrong. The money wasn't the gift. The money was just the key. It was the key that unlocked the door to this life. A life I had to build for myself, piece by piece. My legacy isn't the number in my bank account. It's the smell of paint in my little studio. It's the laughter of the children in the gallery on a Saturday morning. It's the look of hope in the eyes of a woman at the workshop who picks up a paintbrush for the first time. It is the quiet joy of watching the sun rise over the ocean. With a full heart and a clear conscience. That is my masterpiece, and it is priceless. The final stroke. My studio today is quiet. It's a small, light-filled room at the back of my cottage, overlooking a garden where the sea salt seasons the air. The frantic energy of the past few years has settled. Like dust after a storm, what's left is a deep, abiding peace. I am 63 years old now. The lines on my face are deeper, but my hands, for the first time in my life, are steady. On my easel is a new painting, It's almost finished. It's a picture of a single, ancient live oak tree. The kind you see all over this part of the country. Its trunk is thick and gnarled, scarred by time and weather. Its branches are draped with Spanish moss. Like long gray memories, it stands alone in a field, resolute against a sky that is clearing after a storm, and down by its roots, almost hidden in the tall grass, a cluster of small, bright green shoots are pushing their way up toward the light. I've been working on this painting for months. It has taught me things, as the best paintings often do. I look at the massive, sturdy trunk of the oak, and I think about what it means to be a parent. For so long, I believed my job was to be the soil for my son to grow in, to give him everything, my nutrients, my water, my very substance, so that he could stand tall. I thought that was the full measure of a mother's love, but I have learned we must also be the sun to ourselves. For you cannot pour from an empty cup, and you cannot give shade if your own leaves have withered. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's slow erasure. And in erasing myself, I didn't teach my son strength. I taught him that I had none. I think about Daniel sometimes, not with the sharp, tearing pain of before, and not with anger. It's a quieter, more distant ache now, like remembering a song you used to love but have forgotten the words to. I think of him, and I see the small, green shoots at the base of the great tree in my painting. My son chased wealth, thinking it would buy him respect. He didn't understand that respect, like love, cannot be bought. It must be earned, and it begins with gratitude for what you already have, not a constant, gnawing hunger for what you don't. He thought the roots of the tree were a restriction, something to escape from, not realizing they were the very thing holding him to the earth. I hope, wherever he is, that he is learning to grow his own roots now. My granddaughter, Madeline, is 5. Her mother, Chloe, sends me pictures. She has my eyes and a smile that is all her own. I have not met her, not yet. The trust I set up pays for her school, for her doctor's visits. It is a quiet, invisible presence in her life. It is the best I can give her, a foundation, free from the wreckage of the past. Perhaps one day, when she is old enough, she will want to know the story of the woman who planted a garden for her that she could not yet see. I hope so. I pick up my smallest brush, dabbing it in a bit of white paint. I add a final highlight to one of the new green leaves. A tiny fleck of light, a dewdrop, a promise. I step back from the canvas. It is finished. In this loud, fast world, we are told our value lies in what we produce, what we own, what we look like on a screen. We measure our lives in followers and bank statements. For a while, I had $10 million, but I was the poorest I had ever been. But the legacy of Madeline Blackwood wasn't the money. It was the truth she taught me. Our real worth is measured in the silence, in the dignity we keep when it is tested, in the courage to pick up a brush and paint our own canvas, even after someone else has tried to tear it apart. My worth is not in being a mother, or a housekeeper, or a millionaire. It is in the steady beat of my own heart. It is in the smell of turpentine and oil paint in this quiet room. It is in the strength of my own 2 hands. I look at the finished painting, at the old tree standing proud and the new life beginning at its feet. I feel a smile spread across my face, a real one. It reaches my eyes. I set my brush down. I am ready for whatever comes next. Eleanor's story is now told, but it leaves behind a question for us. Where does a mother's love stop? In order to save itself, I would be honored to read your answer in the comments. If her journey moved you, a simple like and a share with someone who understands means the world. Subscribe to Dipu Cater Stories, so we can continue to explore these quiet corners of the human heart, together. Until the next story, thank you for listening.